The dark reason Black history is under attack in America. Black history is not merely a sequence of dates and events. It is not a collection of relics to be shelved in archives or a fragile exhibit locked behind glass for occasional admiration. It is a living current, pulsing with memory and meaning, a testimony of survival against the machinery of oppression, a mirror that reflects both the soaring greatness and the unhealed sins of this nation. And yet, in our present moment, this truth is being suffocated. School boards move to erase it. Politicians rise to vilify it. Entire states wage open war against its teaching. What we are witnessing is not confusion, not debate, not misunderstanding. It is deliberate erasure. It is the silencing of a memory too dangerous to be left alive. For Black history, when told in its unvarnished truth, is a threat to the mythology America clings to, a threat to those who profit from collective amnesia, and a threat to those who tremble at the thought of justice. The assault on Black history is not simply about textbooks or classrooms. It is about the soul of a nation terrified of what truth might unleash. If this resonates with you, I invite you to subscribe for more and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters in keeping this truth alive. Why they fear the truth. The hidden power of Black history. The fear of Black history lies not in the ink of textbooks, nor in the speeches of professors. It lies in the fire of truth it carries. It is feared because it is uncompromising, because it tells a story America would rather bury than face. It insists upon realities that pierce the patriotic veil. That freedom was not a gift tenderly handed down by enlightened founders, but a hard-won prize wrestled from the iron grip of oppressors. That progress did not arrive gently, as the flowering of some inevitable destiny, but emerged blood-soaked through rebellion, resistance, and an unbreakable will to survive. Black history does not whisper comforting myths, it roars with inconvenient truths. And those truths threaten the very foundations of America's cherished mythology. For centuries, this nation has required its people to believe a lie. The lie is seductive, that America was founded on pure ideals, that liberty was its native tongue, and that the sins of slavery and segregation were but minor stains on an otherwise noble tapestry. To believe this lie is to believe that injustice was accidental, brief, and fully overcome. But Black history interrupts that illusion with merciless clarity. It does not flatter. It does not excuse. It insists on remembering that the Constitution was written with slavery in its shadow, that freedom for all never included the millions whose backs bent beneath chains, that the wealth of the nation was constructed from stolen land, stolen labor, and stolen lives. When you teach that truth, you do more than recount the past, you demand a confrontation with the present, because the truth is not dead history, it is living testimony. It echoes in the structures we still inhabit, the neighborhoods still divided by red lines, the prisons still disproportionately filled with Black bodies, the boardrooms still disproportionately white. Black history exposes not just what happened, but what continues. It refuses to permit America the luxury of distance. The power of this truth is precisely why it is feared, for it reveals that racism is not merely an accident of personal prejudice or an occasional eruption of hatred. It is architecture. It is design. It is a system carefully constructed to benefit some while breaking others. To acknowledge systemic racism is to see privilege not as a natural inheritance, but as the spoils of exploitation. It forces a nation to ask not simply what was done, but who continues to benefit. That question is dangerous because it points to accountability, and accountability points to debt. And here lies the crisis. The mythology of American innocence cannot withstand truth. For if America admits its history, it must admit its debts. It must acknowledge that oppression is not a ghost buried in the past, but a living presence breathing in schools, in neighborhoods, in workplaces, in prisons. It must acknowledge that the freedom it celebrates has always been unevenly distributed, that democracy has always been rationed, and such acknowledgement destabilizes the story of purity. It strips away the comforting illusion that America is a self-made, flawless experiment in liberty. It reveals instead that America is a contradiction, a place of soaring ideals and brutal betrayals. That is why they fear Black history, because truth is not neutral. Truth is a scalpel. It cuts illusions open. It unmasks the pretenses of patriotism. It shatters the carefully constructed myth that this nation was always good, always noble, always destined for greatness. And when illusions break, so too does the power built upon them. To face Black history is to confront the story of resistance, the story of people who survived chains and whips, who built families and culture out of fragments, who created music that sang freedom into being, who marched, fought, and bled for rights still denied. That story is not one of victimhood, but of extraordinary power. And power terrifies those who built their empires on silence. Consider the psychology of erasure. If you control memory, you control identity. If you suppress the story of oppression, you convince generations that inequality is natural, that poverty is laziness, that prisons are filled by choice rather than by design. If you erase the fact that enslaved Africans built the wealth of this nation, you allow descendants of that wealth to claim it as merit. If you erase the story of redlining, housing discrimination, and stolen opportunity, you can pretend that racial inequality today is simply the product of individual failure. The suppression of history is not about the past. It is about legitimizing the present. The philosopher Hannah Arendt once warned that the most dangerous weapon of tyranny is not violence, but the manipulation of truth. The rewriting of history is the rewriting of reality. That is precisely what is at stake in the attack on Black history. When you ban books, when you silence teachers, when you strip away honest discussions of race, you are not just controlling narratives. You are controlling futures. You are cultivating ignorance as loyalty. You are manufacturing blindness as patriotism. But truth has a peculiar resilience. It seeps through cracks, whispers in art, resounds in music, echoes in literature, and carries through generations. Black history cannot be fully erased because it is inscribed in the bones of America itself. It is in the soil where cotton once grew, in the railroads built by forced labor, in the wealth of banks that profited from slavery, in the very architecture of cities carved by segregation. To erase it is to erase America itself. The attack on Black history is, in essence, the attack on memory. It is the attempt to sever a nation from its conscience, because memory demands responsibility. Memory insists that the wealth of today has debts unpaid. Memory reminds that the liberty celebrated each 4th of July was not universal. Memory whispers that justice is still incomplete, and such whispers are intolerable to those who thrive on denial. The irony is this: in their fear of truth, America's leaders risk destroying the very possibility of greatness they claim to defend. For greatness is not born of denial but of reckoning. A nation becomes strong not by erasing its sins but by confronting them, learning from them, repairing them. By silencing Black history, America silences its own chance at redemption. Truth, once revealed, is not easily forgotten. It lingers like a shadow until acknowledged. And so long as America tries to bury Black history, the shadow will remain, darkening its democracy, haunting its culture, eroding its legitimacy. For a nation that cannot face truth cannot be free. It will remain shackled to its illusions, enslaved by its own lies. That is the hidden power of Black history. It liberates not only the oppressed, but the oppressor. It insists that justice is not a gift to be delayed, but a demand to be met. It offers the possibility of reconciliation, but only through honesty. It is feared because it forces America to choose, to remain a myth or to become a reality. In the end, what is feared is not history itself, but the revolution of consciousness it brings. To know is to be responsible. To remember is to be called to act. And that call is what terrifies those who profit from silence. So yes, they fear Black history. They fear it because it unmasks them. They fear it because it holds up a mirror in which America sees not only what it was, but what it still is. They fear it because it demands not just remembrance, but repair. They fear it because it refuses to die, because it is truth, and truth, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. And that is the hidden power, the unrelenting, unerasable, undeniable force of Black history. It will continue to burn even when censored. It will continue to speak even when silenced. It will continue to live because truth, unlike illusion, does not crumble when confronted. It endures. And in the end, it is truth, not myth, that has the final word. Erasure as a weapon. How silence protects white supremacy. The attack on Black history is not clumsy, it is deliberate. It is not the mistake of bureaucrats fumbling with school curricula. It is the conscious, calculated weapon of those who fear what truth can do. Erasure has always been one of the sharpest blades wielded by white supremacy. It does not leave bruises on the skin, yet it pierces the soul. It does not spill blood, yet it murders memory. Its violence is not loud but quiet, and in that quiet it performs its most devastating work. It convinces entire generations that the chains of the past never existed, or that they were light, or that they were swiftly broken. Erasure whispers a false story into the ear of America and demands that silence be mistaken for peace. In slavery, the weapon of silence was sharpened against the very minds of the enslaved. They were forbidden to read and write, for literacy would have given them not only knowledge but voice. Their stories were stolen, their African names erased and replaced with tags of property, their genealogies shattered so that descendants would know only fragments of who they were. This was not incidental, it was design. To erase history was to reduce human beings into labor, into capital, into units of production, into things. Silence was not simply the condition of bondage, it was the mechanism of it. To control a people utterly, you must sever them from their own memory. You must leave them unmoored so that they believe their story begins not with kingdoms, families, and cultures across the Atlantic, but with the auction block. Erasure was the perfect weapon, for it erased not only the past, but the very imagination of freedom. In the era of Jim Crow, silence wore new clothes. Propaganda became the instrument of power. Black voices were silenced at the ballot box through poll taxes, literacy tests, and terror. They were segregated from opportunities, barred from schools, neighborhoods, and jobs. Meanwhile, in the cultural imagination, they were caricatured minstrel shows mocking them, newspapers distorting them, textbooks reducing them to footnotes or omitting them entirely. The message was unmistakable. Only one story of America would be told, and it would not include the truth of Black suffering or Black resistance. This was not mere exclusion. It was a deliberate rewriting of reality. It was the institutionalization of amnesia. Children grew up in classrooms where the horrors of slavery were described as labor systems and where Reconstruction was painted as a tragic mistake. Silence became not just the absence of truth, but the active presence of lies. And today, in the 21st century, silence continues its reign, though now it wears the cloak of respectability. The erasure of Black history is disguised in soothing language, protecting children, preserving patriotism, avoiding division. Yet these are not the words of guardianship, they are the words of censorship. Politicians ban books that dare to tell of slavery's brutality. State legislatures, police classrooms, demanding teachers to avoid discussions of systemic racism. In some places, educators are criminalized for teaching the simple fact that America's wealth was built on stolen labor and stolen land. But this is not about protecting children from harm. It is about protecting power from truth. For children who know their history will ask questions, and questions lead to accountability. A population ignorant of its history is a population easily manipulated. A people denied knowledge of systemic injustice will never demand its end. Silence breeds compliance. It cushions the beneficiaries of inequality, allowing them to live untouched by guilt, unchallenged in privilege. If history is erased, then privilege seems innocent, merely the fruit of hard work. If racism is presented as only individual prejudice, then institutions need not change. If slavery is reduced to a regrettable but brief episode, then reparations are unimaginable. Silence preserves comfort. And while the beneficiaries remain comfortable, the oppressed remain isolated. Erasure robs them of the knowledge that their suffering is not random but systemic. that they are heirs not only to wounds, but to a legacy of resistance, brilliance, and dignity. Without that knowledge, they are cut off from the very power that could liberate them. Erasure is not passive, it is violent. It is an assault on memory, an assault on identity, an assault on the very possibility of justice. To silence history is to chain the mind, to cut a people from their roots, to leave them drifting without anchor. The classroom, instead of being a place of liberation, becomes another site of oppression. And in that classroom, what cannot be said becomes more powerful than what is taught. The forbidden truth haunts the silence, and children learn not only from what they read, but from what they are forbidden to read. They are trained in the art of forgetting, and forgetting becomes loyalty. This is the cruel genius of erasure. It transforms ignorance into patriotism. It convinces the majority that to question history is to betray the nation. It reframes silence as virtue, as a mark of unity, as though truth were the true enemy of peace. But peace built on silence is not peace. It is oppression with a smile. It is injustice in disguise. And the result is a nation where ignorance is not accidental but cultivated. It is planted in textbooks, watered by censorship, fertilized by propaganda, and harvested as loyalty to a system that thrives on inequality. White supremacy has always known that its survival depends not only on violence but on silence. Guns and chains may control bodies, but silence controls minds. And the mind, once colonized by falsehood, will police itself. That is why the attack on Black history is so relentless. Because those who control memory control identity, and those who control identity control destiny. But history has a stubborn way of surviving. Truth resists silence. Even in slavery, songs carried memory. Spirituals whispered of liberation, encoded maps of escape. Even under Jim Crow, art, poetry, and music carried the story that textbooks denied. Today, despite bans, students pass books hand to hand, teachers resist in quiet courage, and communities preserve memory through oral traditions and digital archives. Erasure is powerful, but it is never complete. For memory lives not only in books, but in bones, in soil, in names whispered across generations. Still, the violence of erasure leaves scars. A child who never hears of Tulsa's massacre, who never learns of Reconstruction's betrayal, who never reads of Black resistance, inherits a fractured identity. That child grows up in a house of mirrors, seeing only distorted reflections, and the nation grows weaker for it. For a country that silences truth, silences its own possibility. A country that erases history, erases its own conscience. This is the paradox. White supremacy believes silence protects it, yet silence ensures its eventual collapse. Because ignorance breeds fragility. A people taught lies cannot withstand reality when it inevitably intrudes. A democracy founded on myth cannot survive confrontation with truth. By silencing history, white supremacy builds not strength but brittleness. And in that brittleness lies its undoing. To acknowledge this is to recognize why the fight for Black history is not merely academic, it is existential. It is not about curriculum disputes, not about partisan squabbles. It is about whether America chooses to live by myth or by truth, whether it chooses comfort or conscience, whether it chooses silence or justice. Erasure as a weapon has always protected white supremacy, but every weapon has its weakness. And the weakness of silence is that truth, once spoken, echoes. It may be banned from a classroom, but it will find its way into a song, into a march, into a whispered story. It may be censored from a textbook, but it will be carved into memory by those who refuse to forget. Silence is powerful, yes, but silence cannot endure forever because silence is absence and absence cannot build. Not only truth can. And so the war over Black history is not simply about the past. It is about the future. To erase is to imprison a nation in ignorance. To remember is to set it free. That is why they fear it. That is why they silence it. That is why the struggle to defend it is nothing less than the struggle for America's soul. The profit of oppression. Who gains when Black history disappears? To understand why Black history is under attack, one must follow the trail of profit, because erasure is never only about ideas. It is about money, power, and control. History does not vanish by accident. It is erased by those who benefit from its absence. When the stories of Black struggle are silenced, when the truth of oppression is buried, entire industries breathe easier. Entire empires rest undisturbed. The silence of history is not neutral, it is lucrative. It is the quiet that protects wealth, shields privilege, and maintains the illusion that America's greatness is the fruit of innocence rather than exploitation. Consider the first theft, the stolen labor of enslaved Africans. When history forgets this, America's wealth appears to have been built on nothing but ingenuity, innovation, and grit. The plantations that grew cotton, the banks that financed them, the northern textile mills that spun the cotton into fortune, of it is recast as enterprise, stripped of the blood that made it possible. To erase this is to erase the fact that the wealth of Wall Street itself is rooted in the trafficking of human beings, that universities flourished from donations made by slave owners, that fortunes celebrated today were born in the buying and selling of flesh. In this silence, profit disguises itself as virtue. Move forward in time and see how erasure cloaks the devastation of redlining, segregation, and discriminatory policies. When those chapters are deleted from memory, inequality appears as a natural accident. Poverty seems like laziness. Segregated neighborhoods seem like personal choice. Disparities in wealth, health, and education are explained away as unfortunate but random. The system breathes a sigh of relief because if no one remembers the maps that banks drew to keep Black families from buying homes, or the policies that block them from building wealth, then no one will question why the racial wealth gap still yawns so wide. Erasure hides the design of injustice, and in that hiding, injustice is free to flourish. Even now, the exploitation of Black communities is ongoing, yet silence ensures it continues without accountability. Corporations profit from underpaid labor, from predatory lending practices that target Black neighborhoods, from food deserts that keep communities dependent on unhealthy options, from the mass incarceration system that provides cheap, captive labor under the guise of justice. When history ignores these patterns, these profits are protected. They appear as business as usual, rather than as the continuation of oppression. The silence of history is the camouflage of exploitation. Politicians too reap their share of rewards. Erasing history allows them to weaponize ignorance, to stoke fears of indoctrination and division, to rally voters who cling to myths of innocence. They present themselves as defenders of tradition, of heritage, of patriotism, all while waging war on truth. They build careers on denial, using erasure as both sword and shield, striking at opponents who dare to speak truth, and shielding themselves from the accountability that truth demands. Their speeches thunder about unity, while their policies enforce amnesia. In their hands, silence becomes currency, traded for votes, for power, for the loyalty of those desperate to believe the lie of American purity. Institutions, too, thrive on silence. Universities that once barred Black students or exploited their labor now issue glossy brochures celebrating diversity without ever naming the legacy of exclusion that built their prestige. Banks that drew red lines across cities now advertise themselves as champions of opportunity. Real estate empires that profited from segregation now market luxury condos to young professionals, erasing the displaced Black families whose neighborhoods they demolished. Erasure becomes protection for the guilty. It ensures that institutions never have to reckon with their debts, never have to repair the harm, never have to admit that their wealth was purchased at the expense of justice. The attack on Black history, then, is not random. It is not the result of confusion or overzealous parents worried about their children's feelings. It is strategic. It is the carefully orchestrated effort of those who know that truth destabilizes profit. For history, when told truthfully, does not simply inform, it indicts. It points to systems rather than individuals, to legacies rather than accidents, to structures rather than stories. And such indictments demand more than acknowledgement. They demand repair. They demand redistribution. They demand accountability. That demand threatens the pockets of those who thrive on injustice. And so the truth must be buried because silence is cheaper than justice. But silence is not merely protective, it is profitable. When history disappears, wealth remains unchallenged, power remains unthreatened, privilege remains intact, reparations remain unimaginable, injustice remains normalized. Silence does not only protect the guilty, it enriches them. It allows oppression to masquerade as order, exploitation to masquerade as enterprise, inequality to masquerade as fate. It is not simply the absence of noise, it is the soundtrack of profit. Consider mass incarceration. An entire economy of prisons, contractors, and industries thrives on black bodies locked away. If history remembered that this system is the descendant of slavery, if it remembered the convict leasing systems that followed emancipation, if it remembered the policies of the war on drugs designed to target black communities, then the system would be seen for what it is, exploitation in new clothes. But if that history is erased, prisons appear as neutral institutions, merely punishing crime. And in that erasure, billions are made. Consider housing. Real estate values today depend on the very segregation engineered in the 20th century. If history remembered the federal policies that devalued black neighborhoods, the racist covenants that blocked black families from white suburbs, the highways bulldozed through thriving black communities, then the unequal landscapes of today would demand repair. But in the silence, gentrification appears natural, as though communities simply rise and fall by fate. Developers profit, banks profit, cities profit, and history's silence keeps the cash flowing. Even the culture industry profits from erasure. When the contributions of black artists are stolen, repackaged, and sold without credit, the profits flow to others. When the story of black struggle is stripped of its radical edge and transformed into palatable narratives for mainstream consumption, corporations profit. They sell fragments of black culture while erasing the context of pain, resistance, and resilience from which it was born. In this way, even art is commodified through erasure, stripped of its power to indict. What is most insidious is that erasure not only protects profit but also teaches obedience. By silencing history, the powerful convince the oppressed that their suffering is isolated, individual, accidental. Without knowledge of systemic injustice, people blame themselves for their struggles. Without knowledge of their ancestors' resistance, they may not realize their own power. In this way, erasure not only defends profit but suppresses rebellion. It does not only guard the bank accounts of the elite, it guards their thrones. This is why the attack on black history is relentless. It is not about a few books. It is not about a few classrooms. It is about protecting an entire system where inequality is justified, where privilege is naturalized, where accountability is forever postponed. Erasure is the fortress wall around wealth. It is the curtain behind which power hides. It is the silence that allows injustice to masquerade as a normal life. But history, like truth, has a way of returning. Silence cannot erase forever. Buried stories have a habit of rising, whispered in families, sung in music, carved into memory. The more fiercely history is suppressed, the more urgently it seeks expression. And when it emerges, it reveals not only the brutality of oppression, but the greed that sustained it. In the end, the profit of oppression is temporary, for truth is eternal. Those who silence history may enrich themselves in the short term, but they impoverish the nation in the long run. For a country that cannot face its history cannot repair its present. A country that cannot repair its present cannot secure its future. Profit gained through erasure is profit gained through rot, and rot spreads. The dark reason black history is under attack is that it threatens not only the myths of America, but the money of America. It threatens the wealth accumulated on stolen backs, the power maintained through ignorance, the privilege preserved by silence. That is why erasure is pursued so ruthlessly. Because history, when told honestly, does not simply inform, it transforms. It demands justice. And justice is the one thing oppression cannot afford. The real crisis: what America loses when black history is destroyed. The greatest tragedy of erasing Black history is not only what it does to the Black community, but what it does to America itself. A nation that silences truth commits violence against its own soul. It is a form of self-destruction disguised as patriotism, a kind of moral suicide wrapped in the flag. Without Black history, America becomes a stranger to itself. It becomes a nation blind to its own reflection, unable to trace the roots of its inequality, deaf to the echoes of resilience that allowed it to endure, and impoverished of the beauty that comes only from struggle transformed into art, music, philosophy, and spirit. A country without Black history is like a house built on lies, grand in appearance, perhaps but forever unstable, forever haunted by ghosts it refuses to name. The cost of suppression is not abstract. It is not a matter of politics alone, nor of textbooks and classrooms. It is moral, cultural, and democratic. Morally, a nation that denies truth forfeits the right to claim justice. It chooses comfort over conscience, illusion over integrity. It lies to its children and then demands they pledge allegiance to that lie. And in so doing, it teaches generations to mistake denial for virtue, silence for peace, forgetting for freedom. But what is a democracy that cannot bear to face its own history? It is not democracy, it is theater, a performance of freedom without its substance. Culturally, the erasure of Black history robs America of its own richness. The art born from struggle, the music forged in pain yet pulsing with joy, the philosophy written in chains but dreaming of liberation, the spirituals sung as maps to freedom, the intellectual traditions that arose from survival. All of this is the marrow of American culture. Jazz, blues, hip-hop, gospel, literature, theology, political thought. These are not side stories, they are the very heartbeat of the nation's creativity. To erase Black history is not to preserve American culture, but to hollow it out, leaving behind a shell, a caricature, a performance of culture without the depth of its origins. Democratically, the silence is even more catastrophic. A democracy without memory is a democracy doomed to repeat its sins. Without Black history, the story of America's freedom struggles is amputated. Every expansion of liberty in this nation, the abolition of slavery, the Reconstruction Amendments, the Civil Rights Movement, the ongoing fights for equality, was carved out of the blood, sweat, and brilliance of Black resistance. To silence that story is to silence democracy's beating heart. It is to present freedom as a gift handed down by benevolent leaders rather than a demand wrestled from them by those they oppressed. It is to strip democracy of its honesty, to make it appear whole when in fact it has always been contested, fragile, and fought for. When you silence Black history, you silence America's own story of freedom. You silence Frederick Douglass's roar against slavery. You silence Harriet Tubman's path to liberation. You silence the cries of the mothers of Emmett Till and Trayvon Martin. You silence the marchers across Selma's Bridge, the voices that demanded the vote, the workers who organized for dignity, the activists who refused to sit at the back of the bus. These voices are not simply Black voices, they are American voices. Their erasure is not merely an act of injustice against one people, it is the weakening of the entire nation's memory of what it means to fight for liberty. This then is the real crisis, not merely that Black children grow up without knowing their ancestors' greatness, though that wound is deep. Not merely that white children grow up blind to their nation's sins, though that blindness is dangerous. The deeper crisis is that all of America grows weaker, more fragile, more divided. Without truth, there can be no reconciliation. Without memory, there can be no progress. And without progress, the nation begins to rot, to fracture, to stumble toward the very collapse it fears. For a nation that cannot face its truth is like a person who refuses to face their trauma. The pain does not disappear. It festers. It shapes behavior in ways unseen. It drives fear, sheer denial. It erupts in violence, in division, in resentment. America today shows the symptoms of this unhealed wound, the rise of white nationalism, the fear of demographic change, the fury at even the mention of systemic racism. These are not random. They are the eruptions of a country that has silenced its truth and is now haunted by its ghost. And so the attack on Black history is not merely an attack on one community, it is an attack on the very possibility of America. If this erasure continues, America will not only betray its Black citizens, it will betray itself. It will continue to fracture into tribes of myth and denial, each clinging to a false story, none able to face the whole. It will continue to repeat the sins of its past, shackled to cycles of oppression and backlash, progress and retrenchment. It will continue to weaken its own democracy, hollowing it into performance, until it collapses under the weight of its own lies. This is why the call is urgent. Protecting Black history is not optional, it is survival. It is resistance. It is the act of keeping truth alive in a nation addicted to lies. To defend Black history is to defend democracy itself, because democracy cannot live without memory. To defend Black history is to defend justice, because justice cannot live without truth. To defend Black history is to defend the future, because the future cannot be built on denial. Black history is not simply for Black Americans, it is for all Americans. It is the mirror in which the nation must see itself honestly, without makeup, without disguise. It is the story that insists America is not yet what it claims to be, but that it might still become so if it has the courage to confront its past. Black history is the evidence that freedom is never given, always fought for. It is the evidence that dignity can be born in chains, that beauty can be created from suffering, that greatness can emerge even from oppression. To erase that is to erase America's greatest testimony of resilience. If America loses Black history, it loses its soul. And without a soul, no nation can survive. A nation without memory is a corpse walking, a hollow empire waiting to fall. But a nation with memory, even painful memory, still has the chance to heal, to grow, to redeem itself. The question is whether America will choose the hard truth of survival or the easy lie of destruction. The choice then is before us: silence or survival, erasure or truth, death or rebirth. The destruction of Black history is a destruction of America's possibility. The protection of Black history is the protection of America's future. That is the real crisis, and that is the real hope.